Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Dr. Kevan Harris, who is a specialist in Iran, a sociologist who has traveled to Iran and studies both the social activism there, the conflict between various social groups, the authorities, and is going to talk to us today about the next couple of months in Iran and how interesting they're going to be. Kevan, thank you for joining us on CivilNet.
Thanks very much.
Kevan, we're talking about Iran periodically for a bunch of obvious reasons. It's the item that's in the news around the world. It has presidential elections coming up in June, and it's right next door. And so this is a topic that is important to us. I know that you've been to Armenia, and you know the Armenian community in Iran as well.
It's true.
Let's talk about the huge inflation rates, the deep unemployment rates, the large segment of Iranian society that is very young, and talk about what that all means for the upcoming election.
Well, it's well known that Iran, like a lot of Middle Eastern countries, had a sort of baby boom, which now has produced a large youth generation, which is a sizable percentage of the population. And as this generation in Iran has aged, the politics of Iran has changed. So these were often, people who were born during the Iran-Iraq War, and the government was dealing with crises of not only being invaded by a foreign country, but also dealing with how to, keep the standard of living at a certain level during wartime. In the 1990s, this generation went to school and became educated, both male and female in Iran, but with education became new demands, new visions of the good life, and this changed the politics of Iran as sort of a reformist movement entered into the scene and under Mohammad Khatami. And now this generation is of the job-seeking age. So it's actually not as young as it used to be, and now the issues are over economics, and that's why the economy is such a huge issue now, no matter who is going to be running for president.
It's a huge issue no matter who's running for president, but does this mean that the expectations of whoever the other guy is, whoever is not Ahmadinejad's chosen successor, are going to be larger?
Expectations are going to be high on economic issues. I think a lot of people think that a deal with the U.S. will at least stem the flow, stem the damage to the economy that's been ongoing and getting, of course, much worse over the past year. So a lot of people put hope on that, and including a lot of people in the political elite put hope on that. So there's hope that if in this year, maybe with the election of somebody new, that a deal can be made externally, and then of course, the question is what is to be done inside Iran, but the external environment definitely is not making that conversation very easy to have.
Whoever is going to lead Iran, this is the question we ask always because it's the crux of the matter, isn't it? That on the one hand, there is a religious leader, and on the other hand, there are elections for a president. The elections will take place among a field, all of whom are acceptable, and yet there are expectations that something is going to change. How does one deal with that paradox?
I mean, that is the paradox of Iranian politics for the past 20 years, basically. So on the one hand, there are people who say, and every time I go to Iran, I go there every year, I'm going to be there for the elections coming up in June. And every time you go to Iran, people generally are rather disillusioned about the process months before. They say, I'm not going to vote. They're all the same, which is, of course, something you hear about elections in a lot of countries. But the process of having elections, even with a limited field, ends up producing a modicum of competition each time. Every time it's different, and in fact, we don't know who's going to be running for president this year. And I think it's a little bit of a myth that it's always preordained. In fact, the political elite in Iran is responding in various ways to what they feel is the major social pressures. So, there is a give and take to a minimum extent these days between some of the elite and the people, and that's why we don't know actually who's going to be running for president. And given the past surprises in Iranian elections, whether from 1997 with the election of Khatami, or 2005 with Ahmadinejad, or 2009 with the election and then the post-election unrest, I would not count out another sort of exciting moment in Iranian politics, which would again shift the trajectory of the country.
We're always asking also questions about the minorities there, particularly the Armenian minority, and whether minorities are ideologically aligned in Iran or whether they are the silent minorities. Do you have any insights on that?
I mean, on the Armenian Iranian community, I do know quite a few Armenians who live in Tehran. I've been down to Isfahan and the Jolfa area. And when you're in those areas, you do get actually a pretty wonderful sense of community, of the ability of Armenians inside Iran to maintain not only their own culture and religion, but to sort of, live at ease in a society that at times, however, has been hostile, maybe even on a personal level, to Armenians. But I think they've done a pretty good job, and it's really a credit to them and their ability to maintain their own communities over the last 30 years. But, in Isfahan, in the Cathedral Bank Church, in the grounds, there is a memorial outside the grounds there to the Armenian genocide. And I tell people that there's a memorial to the Armenian genocide in Iran, and people don't believe me, but it's been there for at least a decade now. So that's kind of a symbol, at least in terms of Armenian Iranian relations with the state and with society. It's really a case-by-case basis. Azeri Turks are, of course, well integrated in Iranian society. They are in the political elite, including and the economic elite. Kurds are really a divided community between sort of political activists and then others who, of course, there's Shia Kurds in the east of Iran that no one talks about. And then we have Arabs in the southwest and Baluchis in the southeast, and those two communities also had various issues with the state. But again, I think it's a divided question. It's one that we don't know a lot about because people tend not to write about these issues in a balanced way.
One of the things that Armenians are quite pleased with as far as relations with Iran goes is that Iran has maintained a very fair, unaligned, objective position regarding the Qarabağ issue vis-a-vis both Azerbaijan and Armenia. That's in their foreign policy. Internally, have you read of, heard of, talk of internal pressures on the Iranian government to align one way or another?
They stayed pretty neutral on this issue. And in fact, when the sort of ethnic question is raised, which state they're going to support or which state they want to side with, this is pretty widespread across the political elite in Iran. They stress the sort of multi-ethnic quality of Iran. It's actually a rather successful and rare case these days in the 21st century of a multi-ethnic society that has, survived war, revolution, upheavals, sanctions, etc. And the reason people don't know it's a multi-ethnic society is because it hasn't had a big implosion or a war, and so you don't see it on CNN or on BBC. And I think this has as much as particular members of the political elite like to express the religious character of the state. It's really this sort of multi-ethnic nationalism that really permeates, I think, a lot more of the policies over the last 15, 20 years. And that plays out in foreign policy because, on foreign policy, they're very realistic, especially in the region. And, sort of Iran has this sort of historical territorial boundaries. They have a sort of conception of the national interest that hasn't changed over the last 100 years. And that's basically is what determines the regional policies now.
Last question, Iranian diaspora. Does it play any sort of role? Does it expect to be playing a role in the upcoming elections, even if it's simply via Facebook and Twitter? And does that matter?
They're always important, and of course, it's not a homogenous community, just like the Armenian diaspora is not a homogenous community. There's Iranians, of course, in Turkey. There's Iranians in Armenia. There's Iranians in the Gulf states, as well as, of course, in Europe and the United States. And as the elections, are getting closer, you'll see, members of this community take particular positions on various candidates. Often, some of them are going to be quite critical, I can guarantee, about the whole process. But I've lived in Iran for several years. I've traveled every year, and at some point over the last 10 years, there was a switch I felt between the fact that the diaspora had more sort of clout, cultural clout, social clout, economic clout than internally, and that basically has ended. I think that inside Iran, people are proud, at least of their culture, of their history, and I think that they now know that they're going to determine the history of Iran, the future of Iran, not the diaspora as much.
Yeah, famous last words. It was good talking to you. Thank you for giving us the time on CivilNet, and please let's talk again before the elections and perhaps while you're in Iran during that election period.
Thank you very much.
We've been talking to Kevan Harris, a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton, a sociologist, a specialist on Iran. Thank you for following us on CivilNet.